The night the clock would not stop, no one inside the prison ever forgot how quiet death row became after midnight. Not because it was peaceful, but because every man there knew what silence meant. It meant a clock was moving somewhere behind concrete walls. It meant paperwork had already been signed. It meant phones were ringing in places families never wanted to hear from. For the man in cell 17, midnight was no longer a time on a clock. It was a destination. He had been on death row long enough to watch guards retire, wardens change, and fellow inmates disappear, sometimes transferred, sometimes exonerated, sometimes executed. Death row teaches you patience the way water teaches stone erosion. Slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. Outside those walls, his mother still set an alarm every morning just to hear his voice during the short call window. She never told him she did that. Some truths were too heavy to share. His sister stopped watching the news years ago. Every breaking headline felt like it might carry his name. Friends learned not to bring him up in conversation, not because they didn't care, but because caring hurt too much. And the jury? The jury had gone home decades earlier believing they had done the right thing. What they didn't know was that the story they were given was incomplete, carefully trimmed, selectively presented, and strategically silent. That silence would echo for years. Inside death row, rumors traveled faster than official notices. Inmates knew something was coming before the announcement ever arrived. When a guard avoids eye contact, when footsteps pause outside a cell just a second too long, when dinner trays arrive without words, death row understands the language. The man in cell 17 sat on his bunk that night, holding letters he had already read 100 times. Words from people who believed him. Words from people who once doubted him. Words from people who would never forgive themselves for not doing more. He wasn't afraid in the way movies make fear look. He was exhausted. Exhausted from explaining his innocence. Exhausted from hoping courts would listen. Exhausted from knowing that truth doesn't always win, especially when the system decides it's done looking. Other inmates tapped messages through the walls, a quiet code of respect, solidarity, and grief. Death row is a place where guilt and innocence coexist, but execution makes no distinction once the process begins. Some men prayed. Some stared into space. Some wrote letters they knew would arrive too late. Beyond the prison gates, the community slept, unaware that history was about to be written in their name. What no one outside knew was that evidence existed. Evidence that never made it into the courtroom. A statement that was altered. A timeline that didn't fit. A witness whose doubts were buried under procedure. The jury never heard it. They were never allowed to hear it. And now, decades later, the system was prepared to move forward as if nothing had been missed. The man in cell 17 was informed earlier that evening. No long explanation. No apology. Just confirmation. Midnight. His lawyer had tried everything. Appeals stacked on appeals. Motions denied with language so cold it felt automated. At some point, legal words lose meaning and turn into numbers, dates, and deadlines. To the state, this was closure. To the family, it was reopening a wound that never healed. His mother sat awake, staring at a phone that hadn't rung yet. She remembered the boy he was before the case, before the headlines, before the word death row entered their vocabulary like a curse. Friends gathered in silence, unsure what to say, unsure what words still mattered. Even some of the guards struggled with the weight of it. Years of professionalism couldn't erase the knowledge that once midnight passed, nothing could be undone. And still, the jury didn't know. They didn't know what had been hidden. They didn't know what had been withheld. They didn't know that their verdict rested on a version of the truth that was incomplete. As the clock moved closer to midnight, one question lingered in every mind that mattered. What happens when justice moves forward without the full truth? And what happens to a society that allows that to happen, quietly, efficiently, and on schedule? The lights dimmed slightly. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, and death row held its breath. Because once midnight arrives, there is no rewind. Stay with this story, because what was hidden from the jury is only beginning to surface. Courtrooms have a strange way of feeling permanent. Wooden benches polished by decades of nervous hands. Flags standing still in air that smells faintly of paper and authority. Jurors told to listen carefully, to weigh facts, to decide a human life based on what is placed in front of them. What no one tells the jury is this: they only judge what they are allowed to see. Years earlier, when the man from cell 17 first sat at the defense table, the room was full. Reporters scribbled notes. Family members stared at the floor. Prosecutors spoke with confidence, presenting a story that felt complete, logical, airtight. A crime had occurred. A suspect had been identified. A timeline had been established. And the jury believed they were seeing the full picture. They weren't. There was a witness who hesitated before testifying, a pause that never made it into the transcript. The hesitation was explained away, brushed off as nerves. What the jury didn't hear was that this witness had originally given a different version of events, one that didn't fit the prosecution's narrative. That earlier statement existed. It sat quietly in a file, never mentioned. There was forensic information that didn't match the timeline presented in court. Not enough to scream innocence on its own, but enough to raise serious questions. Questions that defense attorneys tried to ask and were blocked from fully exploring. Objection sustained. Move on. Irrelevant. Those words shape outcomes more than most people realize. The jury never knew that an alternative suspect had briefly been considered and dismissed without explanation. Never knew that a tip had come in pointing somewhere else. Never knew that follow-up was minimal, because once a theory gains momentum, changing course becomes inconvenient. Justice moves faster when doubt is ignored. During deliberations, jurors debated details that mattered, at least details they believed mattered. They replayed testimony, re-examined evidence, argued late into the evening. Some were uneasy. Others were convinced. All believed they had everything they needed. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration, just relief that the burden of deciding someone else's fate had been lifted. They went home. Life continued. But for the man sent to death row, the trial never ended. In the years that followed, pieces began surfacing. A former investigator spoke quietly to a journalist. A document was found during a routine records request. A defense intern noticed a discrepancy that should have been obvious years earlier. Each discovery raised the same question. Why wasn't this shown to the jury? Appeals were filed. Motions submitted. Courts acknowledged the omissions, but acknowledgement doesn't equal reversal. Legal systems are designed to value finality. Once a verdict hardens, changing it becomes harder than admitting a mistake. The man on death row learned this the slow way. Every denied appeal landed differently, not as anger, but as realization. That truth, on its own, is not always enough. It has to arrive at the right time, through the right channel, in the right format, or it simply becomes background noise. His family absorbed the damage quietly. His mother replayed the trial in her mind, remembering moments that felt wrong even then. His sister kept a folder of articles, hoping one day someone with authority would read them carefully. Friends started advocacy pages, shared documents, asked questions online. Some people listened. Others scrolled past. Attention is fleeting, injustice is not. Inside death row, other inmates watched this unfold with a familiarity that was unsettling. Many had their own stories of evidence never tested, witnesses pressured, details overlooked. They offered advice that sounded more like survival tips than legal strategy. Don't expect them to admit it, one inmate said through the bars. They already decided. As midnight crept closer in the present day, the weight of what the jury never heard became unbearable. Somewhere, those jurors were living ordinary lives, working jobs, raising families, still believing their decision was based on the full truth. They were never told otherwise. The community, too, had moved on. The case was considered resolved. Closure achieved. But closure built on incomplete truth is fragile, and it cracks under pressure. Now, as execution approached, journalists began revisiting the case. Old documents resurfaced. Questions that should have been asked decades ago were finally being asked, loudly, publicly. Too late. The jury had been shielded. The truth had been delayed. And the system was preparing to move forward anyway. This is where the story shifts. Because once people realize what was hidden, they're forced to confront something far more uncomfortable than guilt or innocence. What responsibility do we carry when silence becomes policy? And what does justice mean when truth arrives after the deadline? Stay with this, because the psychological toll of that silence didn't just destroy one life. It fractured families, haunted jurors, and left a community questioning what justice actually costs. The clock was still moving, and the hardest part was yet to come. There is a moment in every long injustice when the damage stops being loud and becomes permanent. For the man on death row, that moment didn't arrive with the guilty verdict or the first denied appeal. It arrived years later, quietly, when he realized that even if the truth came out tomorrow, time would never be returned. Death row changes how people measure life. Days are counted, not lived. Birthdays pass without celebration. Holidays arrive without meaning. The future shrinks into a narrow corridor of routine and waiting. But the deeper damage spreads outward. His mother aged in fast forward. Every phone call felt like a countdown. Every knock at the door triggered panic. She learned to recognize the sound of official voices before they even spoke. Friends stopped asking how she was doing because the answer never changed. She lived in a permanent state of anticipation, not hope, not despair, but something worse, suspension. His sister carried a different burden. She became the strong one, the organizer, the voice when others were too tired to speak. She memorized case details the way people memorize prayers. She could explain the inconsistencies, the missing evidence, the unanswered questions better than most lawyers. And still, she wasn't listened to. Friends from before the arrest drifted away over the years, not out of cruelty, but helplessness. What do you say to someone whose brother is on death row? What do you offer when injustice has no expiration date? Inside the prison, the psychological toll deepened. The man in cell 17 became someone others sought out, not because he had answers, but because he listened. He had learned how to absorb silence without breaking. New inmates arrived loud, angry, defiant. Years later, they became quieter. Watching that transformation was like watching a slow erosion of the human spirit. Fellow inmates felt his approaching execution long before it was officially announced. There's a tension that builds, a heaviness that settles into the air. Conversations shorten. Laughter disappears. Everyone becomes aware of their own fragility. Some inmates avoided him. Others sat longer, spoke slower, as if trying to store memories they knew would soon be all they had left. The guards felt it too, even if they never said it out loud. Some kept their distance. Others became unexpectedly gentle. The job demanded neutrality, but neutrality becomes complicated when you see the same face every day for years. Outside the prison walls, the community remained divided, though many didn't even realize it. To some, the case was settled history. To others, it was a quiet shame that resurfaced whenever the death penalty was discussed. Churches held prayer meetings. Advocacy groups organized candlelight vigils. People argued online, half-informed, emotionally invested, often cruel. And somewhere in the middle were the jurors. Years after the trial, one juror stumbled across an article questioning the conviction. At first, it felt like an accusation. Defensive instincts kicked in. They had followed the law. They had listened carefully. They had done their duty. But doubt has a way of slipping through cracks. That juror began reading more. Documents surfaced. Timelines didn't align. Statements contradicted what had been presented in court. The realization came slowly, painfully. They had never been told everything. Another juror experienced the same awakening years later through a podcast episode. Then another through a late-night news segment. None of them were contacted officially. None of them were asked to reconsider. They were expected to live with it. Guilt doesn't always arrive as regret. Sometimes it arrives as insomnia. Sometimes it arrives as anger. Sometimes it arrives as an unshakable question that follows you into old age. What if we were wrong? As execution neared, media attention intensified. Reporters requested interviews. Old prosecutors declined to comment. Officials emphasized procedure, legality, closure. But closure is a word that means very different things depending on where you stand. For the victim's family, reopening the case felt like betrayal. They had grieved, rebuilt, tried to move forward. Questioning the conviction felt like reopening a wound they never asked to revisit. For the man's family, closure had never existed. They lived in a world of perpetual waiting, perpetual defense, perpetual explanation. Every conversation required context. Every introduction came with an invisible asterisk. Inside death row, the man in cell 17 began giving away what little he had. Books passed from cell to cell. Notes scribbled into margins. Personal items with no monetary value but immense emotional weight. He wrote letters he wasn't sure would be read in time. Not pleas, not accusations, reflections, memories. Apologies for things he never got to become. He thought often about the jury, not with anger, but curiosity. Did they still believe? Had they questioned? Did any of them lie awake at night the way his family did? The psychological cruelty of death row isn't just the waiting. It's the knowledge that truth can exist and still be powerless. The community felt the pressure building. Protests grew. Editorials were published. Social media amplified voices that had once been ignored. But algorithms move faster than justice, and attention burns hot and brief. As midnight approached, everyone involved felt the same unstoppable momentum. Not because no one cared, but because caring had collided with a system designed to keep moving. This chapter of the story forces a harder question than guilt or innocence. How many lives does one execution truly touch? Because when the state prepares to take one life, it also reshapes families, haunts jurors, scars communities, and teaches everyone watching a dangerous lesson: that certainty matters more than truth. And as the clock continued its quiet march forward, the weight that never leaves settled in deeper. The final hours were approaching, and by then, everyone understood whatever happened next would echo far beyond the prison walls. Stay with this story, because the night of the execution doesn't just end a life. It reveals what a society is willing to live with afterward. The day of the execution didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in. Morning light filtered through narrow windows that weren't meant for hope. On death row, days like this are announced without ceremony. No speeches. No acknowledgement of significance. Routine is the disguise the system wears when it's about to do something irreversible. The man in cell 17 woke before the lights came on. He had slept lightly, not from fear, but from familiarity. After decades of waiting, the body learns when something final is approaching. He washed his face slowly, noticing details he had stopped paying attention to years ago: the sound of running water, the texture of the concrete wall, the way time felt heavier than usual. Every small action carried weight because he knew it might be the last time he did it. Down the corridor, other inmates were awake too. No one needed to say why. Death row operates on a shared awareness that words can't improve. Some men prayed quietly. Others stared forward, refusing to look toward cell 17, as if eye contact might make it real. One inmate pressed his palm against the wall, a silent gesture of respect. Another whispered a message that traveled through vents and cracks, encouragement mixed with apology. Death row teaches men how to grieve in advance. Guards moved differently that day. Their voices were lower. Their instructions were precise. They followed protocol because protocol is what keeps emotions at bay. But behind professionalism were human reactions no manual could eliminate. Some guards avoided being assigned to the unit. Others volunteered, believing presence mattered, even if they couldn't change the outcome. Years of shared routines blur lines between authority and familiarity. Outside the prison, families prepared in very different ways. His mother had not slept. She sat at a kitchen table that had once hosted birthday cakes and schoolbooks. She stared at a phone that felt heavier than it should. She had already said goodbye too many times to count, but none of them felt final enough to prepare her for this. His sister drove toward the prison, hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying every legal argument she had memorized. Logic had long stopped being comfort. All that remained was witness, the need to be present, even when presence changed nothing. Friends gathered quietly. Some prayed. Some sat in silence. Some scrolled endlessly, refreshing feeds, hoping for a miracle that logic said would not come. And then there were the jurors, scattered across different lives, different cities, different realities, all unknowingly connected to this day. One juror felt uneasy without knowing why. Another avoided the news altogether. Another followed updates obsessively, unable to reconcile procedure with doubt. None of them were asked to speak. None of them were invited to weigh in. Their role had ended years ago. As the day moved forward, legal efforts continued until the very last moment. Emergency motions filed, calls placed, judges consulted, language carefully chosen. Everyone involved understood the odds, but procedure demands effort even when hope is thin. Each denial arrived the same way: formal, detached, final. For the man on death row, time shifted. Minutes stretched. Sounds sharpened. Thoughts slowed. He wasn't thinking about death the way outsiders imagine. He was thinking about life. Moments he never had. Paths never taken. Apologies never needed but still felt. He thought about the jury. about what they would have said if they had known everything, about how differently that courtroom might have felt if silence hadn't been part of the strategy. He thought about the community that would soon carry this day as history, whether they wanted to or not. Spiritual advisors came and went. Words of comfort offered without pressure. No one tried to explain meaning. Some things resist explanation. As evening approached, the atmosphere thickened. News vans lined the roads outside the prison. Protesters gathered, some holding signs, others candles. Not all of them agreed on the details of the case, but all of them felt the gravity of the moment. Inside, death row became quieter than ever. Dinner trays were delivered without conversation. The man in cell 17 barely touched his food. Hunger had become irrelevant. He spent time writing, revising sentences he had already rewritten dozens of times. He wanted his words to survive even if he could not. He wrote to his mother, telling her she did more than enough. He wrote to his sister, thanking her for carrying what he could not. He wrote to the jury, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating what had been hidden, hoping knowledge might ease their burden one day. As the clock approached midnight, the prison moved into final protocol. Doors opened and closed with mechanical precision. Every step followed rules designed to remove uncertainty. But uncertainty remained, not about what would happen, but about what it meant. Guards escorted him down corridors he had never seen before, spaces deliberately kept separate from daily life. The walk was not long, but it felt endless. Every sound echoed. Witnesses were seated. Paperwork reviewed again. Everything checked twice. Finality leaves no room for mistakes, only regret. Outside, his family waited for confirmation they hoped would never come. Friends refreshed pages. Strangers argued online, some with empathy, some with cruelty, many without understanding the full story. The community held its breath. Midnight arrived quietly. There was no announcement that could match the weight of the moment. No sound loud enough to define it. The prison continued functioning because prisons do not pause for reflection. What followed was not spectacle. It was process. Controlled. Measured. Irreversible. And then it was done. The state recorded the time. Paperwork was completed. Official statements prepared. Language chosen carefully to emphasize procedure over consequence. Inside death row, men sat in silence, absorbing the reality that one of them was gone. Not transferred. Not released. Gone. Some cried quietly. Others stared forward. A few closed their eyes and refused to speak for the rest of the night. For the guards, the shift ended eventually. Uniforms were hung up. Cars were driven home. Some slept. Others didn't. All carried something they would not talk about. For the family, the phone rang. No words can prepare a person for confirmation. No phrasing softens it. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in, slowly, then all at once, then again in waves that never fully recede. His mother collapsed into a chair that suddenly felt too empty. His sister sat still, unable to cry yet. Friends hugged without speaking. The community reacted in fragments. Headlines broke. Statements were released. Debates reignited. Some called it justice. Others called it tragedy. Many scrolled past. But something had shifted. Because once an execution happens, questions don't disappear, they multiply. People began asking what the jury had been told, what had been withheld, why doubts raised too late were treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. The night could not be undone. And now, the hardest part began, living with what happened. Stay with this story, because the aftermath reveals more than the execution ever could. What a society does after the clock stops tells you everything about what it truly values. The world did not stop when the execution ended. That is the part no one prepares you for. Morning arrived the same way it always does. Traffic returned to familiar routes. Coffee brewed. Phones buzzed with notifications. Somewhere, children went to school without knowing that a life had ended hours earlier in their name. Somewhere else, people scrolled past a headline without opening it. But for those closest to the case, time fractured. The family woke into a reality that no longer required waiting. For decades, waiting had been their language. Waiting for appeals, waiting for calls, waiting for hope to show itself in unexpected places. Now there was nothing left to wait for. His mother sat in a quiet room, holding letters she had already memorized. They no longer felt like communication. They felt like proof. Proof that he existed. Proof that he mattered. Proof that love outlived procedure. Grief did not arrive as hysteria. It arrived as confusion. As moments where she reached for the phone out of habit, then remembered. as thoughts that began with, "I should tell him," and ended abruptly. His sister experienced something different, a sharp clarity that felt almost disorienting. Anger didn't explode, it settled. She began asking questions more urgently, not because she expected answers now, but because silence had become unacceptable. Friends gathered and tried to find language that could carry the weight. Some spoke about injustice. Others spoke about faith. Some simply sat together, realizing that shared silence was the only honest response. Inside the prison, death row felt emptier in a way that couldn't be measured. Cell 17 remained, but its presence was louder than its absence. Inmates avoided looking toward it. Guards walked past it faster than usual. Execution does not just remove a person, it leaves a vacuum. Men who had spent years exchanging quiet conversations through walls now faced the truth that nothing they said could reach him anymore. Some questioned their own futures. Others questioned the system. All felt the reminders settle deeper. Time here is borrowed, and certainty is an illusion. Outside the walls, the community began its slow reckoning. Journalists revisited the case with fresh urgency. Documents were analyzed publicly. Experts spoke on panels. Words like oversight and procedural failure entered headlines. For the first time, many people learned what had been hidden from the jury. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. Some jurors came forward quietly, asking questions they had never been encouraged to ask before. One admitted that doubt had followed them for years, growing louder with each new revelation. Another spoke of sleepless nights, of replaying deliberations in their mind, wondering how differently things might have gone if they had known everything. They were not villains. They were not careless. They were incomplete, just like the information they were given. The justice system responded the way institutions often do after irreversible decisions, with distance. Statements emphasized legality, adherence to protocol, respect for final rulings. Language was carefully chosen to protect process over outcome. But something had shifted. Public trust, once shaken, does not return easily. People began asking broader questions, not just about this case, but about how many others followed the same pattern. How many juries were asked to decide without full truth? How many executions carried unanswered questions into history? Faith leaders addressed congregations. Professors discussed the case in classrooms. Advocacy groups organized forums where grief and outrage mixed with determination. This was no longer just one story. It had become a mirror. For the victim's family, the aftermath was complicated. Some felt relief that the legal process had concluded. Others felt the ground shift beneath them as new information surfaced. Justice, they realized, was not a single emotion. It was layered, fragile, and often painful. For the man's family, grief and purpose collided. They did not want sympathy without understanding. They did not want outrage without action. They wanted the truth acknowledged, not to undo the past, but to prevent repetition. His sister began speaking publicly, not with accusation, but with precision. She cited documents. She quoted timelines. She spoke calmly, deliberately, knowing that emotion alone could be dismissed. People listened. Inside death row, inmates followed the news closely. They understood something outsiders often miss. When attention focuses on one case, it briefly illuminates them all. For a moment, their stories felt visible. For a moment, hope flickered, not for release, but for recognition. Some wrote letters to journalists. Others prepared legal filings inspired by renewed scrutiny. Death row, once again, became a place where waiting took on a new meaning. The guards watched this shift from the margins. Some questioned policies they had followed for years. Others avoided discussion altogether. Everyone carried their own version of the aftermath. Months passed. The case entered documentaries, articles, debates. It became a reference point, a cautionary tale. Lawmakers cited it when discussing reform. Critics cited it when condemning capital punishment. Supporters of the system cited procedure to defend finality. But the man himself was no longer part of those arguments. He existed only through memory, words, and the uncomfortable knowledge that truth arrived too late. And that is where this story ultimately lands. Not in the execution chamber, not in the courtroom, but in the space afterward. The space where a society must decide what lessons it is willing to carry forward. Because justice is not just about verdicts. It is about transparency. It is about humility. It is about acknowledging that certainty without completeness is dangerous. The jury never heard everything. The The system moved forward anyway. And now, everyone else must live with that choice. If this story stayed with you longer than expected, that matters. If it unsettled something, that matters. Stories like this are not meant to be consumed and forgotten. They are meant to challenge comfort. Because the most haunting question is not whether one man was guilty or innocent. It is this: what do we do when we realize the truth came too late? And what are we willing to change so it doesn't happen again? After midnight, the silence speaks. And whether we listen determines what kind of justice exists tomorrow.